related to both sewer shed as well as any type of plan view work is the markup. So one of those is the data view, so you can just view any XP table data you have per object. We'll cover that, as well as the spatial reporting, which is oftentimes the tooltips. This is the text representation of input or output data that you define, as well as graphical encoding, and that is more the visual of changing nodes or links, changing their color or other physical visual attributes based on input or output data. So what I'll do here is turn off some of my background imaging so you can see it directly. And we mentioned three different things. The first being a different way to look at your XP table data. So if I click it over my XP table, you can see at the bottom of my screen, hopefully you can see there's lots of different tables. So for instance, this is a manhole data table with lots of data. What if I wanted to see all this information for a specific manhole? Well, that's something I can in fact do if I select this manhole number 200. And over here, this quick data view, you may have used this before. You can actually use this to query GIS data, but in my case, I want to view my node data. So here, if I go to manhole data, you saw all my XP tables. There are many more than three, but the program's smart enough to know that these are the three that relate to nodes. So I click on manhole data, node number 200. I get to see all the variations and variables for this number 200, which is great. In fact, if I had output data that I was showing here too, that would also show up in this table view. Again, sometimes people use this for GIS to be able to query the GIS. It's something you want to do. I'll pin that out of the way. Now, as far as layers, one thing we can do, there we go, bring that back. As far as other things we can show, well, let's cover graphical encoding next. So I turn on graphical encoding here. You can see some pretty data in my plan view. How do we get that? Well, I do a right click and go to properties, and now we have our graphical encoding. Over here you see I have node color. Well, I need to pick a variable before I can start changing the visual representation of that. So in this case, this is an output file, and I'm looking at an output variable of max water depth, and I'm using, this is US, so it would be in feet. If I were to left click here, you can see all the different results. This is hydraulic results. Of course, you're not just related or relegated to hydraulics. If you're doing sanitary runoff and you had no data there, you could do it. And so I can make those changes, hit OK. And then over here for node, I can do color, size, and label size. And I can do all of those based on different variables if I want. If I click on node color, a lot of times what you want to do is hit a suggest, and it'll give you a suggested ramp. And you can hit OK. It shows you the range here. This has a fairly large range because there's a fairly large lift station lifting pretty high. So you can see some pretty high water depths. Similar idea here. So link color, you see that's grayed out because I actually need to pick a variable. And there's all my conduit data. And maybe it is an output data, maybe it's something simpler, maybe it's just diameter. And so in my case, most of mine are single conduits. Again, if I click link color, I can suggest that, and it shows you I have up to a 36-inch, and then I can hit encode, and it shows up, and I also have the legend there. That's something I can just toggle on and off to show the results. And that's really nice for kind of an overall view. So in this case, maybe I just want to look at where my larger lines are, and I can even turn labels. I get an idea of where the smaller lines are and the larger lines are. Turn that back on, turn off my sewer sheds, my catchments. The last thing I want to cover in the time I've got is the spatial reports. So I'll turn off the encoding now, and we'll turn spatial reports on. That, if you're not familiar with, is the idea of, in this case, a tooltip. So I'm holding over the node, and I see some results, or I'm holding it over the link, and I see some results. That can be really nice when you're trying to get through sections of data. How do you do that? Well, under spatial reports, under nodes, I can right-click and look at the properties, and I can change the variables. So I've gone to properties and then variables, and here you can see I want node name and I want max water depth. But you notice potentially that it looked a little different than that when it actually showed up as a tooltip. If I click on format, I can change how I want that displayed. So in this case it says node colon, and then it puts in the name, and then for max water depth I can have the max D and then the unit afterwards. So I have a little bit of availability to change what's in front of or after the variable itself, as well as formatting like how many decimal places, etc. You have lots of other things you could change. In fact, believe me when I say that you could spend a long time here to get this looking exactly like you want. This was just the variables. You can also make some changes depending on the choice you make on how the frame looks itself for both nodes and links. Hit OK. And let's see, similarly for links. But for these right now, I've said tooltips. You need to be a little careful. If you do all objects, sometimes you get something like this, which may actually make a lot of sense if you're very well zoomed in. If you're very well zoomed in this case, it may make sense to show everywhere what the max flow is for the pipes, kind of like labeling those. Usually, it would be something more like a tooltip, which basically will only show it when you're hovered over it. And that's a quick review of 3 different ways in plan view to look at data. And that was the quick data view, which is pulling in a single value from XP tables, graphical encoding, which is showing you a visual cue, color, width, or label based on input or output data, or spatial reports, which is more of a textual-based review of data. Applicable, obviously, to sanitary sewer as well as to really any type of model review.